Hello, everybody. I am here with Dean Krishnan from the Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon University, and I actually happen to be an alumnus of Carnegie Mellon. So this interview is extremely special and much closer to my heart to have a dean of one of the most foremost colleges at Carnegie Mellon, especially relevant in the context of the book, since the Heinz College houses both the information systems and the public policy programs at Carnegie Mellon. So this is going to be a fabulous conversation since the dean helms this organization in addition to being an expert in technology, operations research, entrepreneurship, and so many more things. So Dean Krishnan, thank you so much for doing this. I truly appreciate this.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Terrific. So, Dean, if we could just jump into, why as Dean, as advisor on policy, advisor on AI, etc., why keep an eye on the future? Why is this topic even relevant and interesting?
I think we are seeing, and perhaps this has been even more pronounced post-COVID, but going into COVID, the idea that you could use technology to do work from home, for instance, that was effectively required by policy to keep people safe, led people to realize that you don't have to perform work in quote unquote what I'll refer to as the old-fashioned way, which is 9 to 5, going in each day of the week. Now, depending on which profession you are in, you're probably already doing that in consulting in certain sectors. People did not necessarily go in every day to work, but the vast majority of us certainly followed a schedule which required in-person work. So one change was, I think, one shock, if you will, you want to think of it that way, was COVID was a shock to the system. It got people to recalibrate and to think really about where they wanted to live, how they wanted to work, a bunch of those kinds of questions. Now, that's not technology alone, but actually a fundamental change in mindset in many settings. For instance, at Carnegie Mellon, we went on, as with many other organizations, I expect, right after the pandemic came about, we went to fully remote education. But we recognized that doing work entirely remotely didn't work well either. So we brought people back in the fall of 2020 with appropriate safeguards. And slowly, as the pandemic ebbed and vaccinations came about, we went to full in-person teaching, because in education, we felt that it was really important to have the in-person experience, not just between the instructor and the students, but between students and between faculty and students. So I think human connectivity and interaction with one another and the implications of that for creative work, for serendipity, all of those kinds, the proverbial water cooler conversation, if you will. I think where we are is in a world which is still in flux, in my view. I think from a societal standpoint, from an organizational standpoint, I was at Google yesterday, and it was Monday, and they said, post-COVID, Mondays and Fridays, they tend to be lean days. So that's an example of something that wouldn't have been the case pre-pandemic, right?
Oh.
So I think one is a societal and organizational change. The other is that the technology has gotten a whole lot better. You and I, you're in Mumbai, I'm in Pittsburgh, and we're talking. This would not have been easily possible pre-pandemic. I mean, Zoom took off in a big way during the pandemic. So that's the second piece. And then the last piece, I think, with regard to keeping an eye on the future is, I think, along with any disruption, be it of societal mores or caused by technology, you always want to ask yourself what the implications of that are. It's always hard to predict the future, but I think it's important to gain situational awareness of what's going on. And that's where we're at right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think you touched upon COVID being the sort of flexion point and then bouncing us into changes in society as well as technology. So since you've touched upon these two nodes and since you are an expert on policy making, I'm going to throw in globalization as a third factor. So if we could touch upon these three: society, technology, and globalization, in terms of the future, what do you see as implications of the future given the changes in these three realms?
Well, with regard to the first two, I mentioned societal norms being reset, recalibrated. Now, it might well happen that 3, 4 years from now, we have gone back to what was pre-pandemic, just so you're aware. I mean, we are in this flux between, yeah, we are in this change period.
Do you
With
think
regard
it might go back? Do you actually think it might go back?
Well, I mean, my sense is there were firms that basically said you never have to come back
Sure,
during the pandemic, and they've all gone back and said no, you have to come back.
sure.
So my sense is something along the lines of where we want to get the benefits of flexibility while retaining the value of being close to one another. I think some new equilibrium is going to come about. What that is, whether it's a 3-2 schedule, like Monday, Friday being lean and people being together Tuesday through. I mean, I don't want to say that that's actually going to be what's going to happen. Or are you going to see more distributed organizations and people and teams where people live elsewhere and are plugged in via technology in ways that, like many consulting companies actually work? So one is this reset in societal norms. The second is it's not just Zoom. I think the technology continues to grow and grow rapidly in terms of what its capabilities are. And in that, in particular, AI has been a very significant, with the advent of ChatGPT last November to now, and now with Bard and Gemini, there's this tremendous pace of innovation in terms of how work is going to potentially be done. Not just digital work, it's going to be also work that spans digital and physical. So those are two things on societal norms and technology. You also added globalization in there. I think one of the, I guess, post-COVID implications was that the view was that we had optimized supply chains for efficiency and cost and not sufficiently for resilience. And therefore, there was a need to rethink our supply chains. And again, we are in a state of sort of transformation or transition there as well. So this idea of building more resiliency explicitly as an objective part of the objective function versus just cost effectiveness or cost efficiency, I think is what's causing where people, where firms will source their materials, where they will actually locate their factories, but equally well, where people will actually be sourced from as well. So I think there's going to be some really interesting evolution in terms of where work gets done. So you can think of supply chains not just in terms of physical supply chains, as in movement of materials. So
The
for
movement of
instance,
labor as well, you're saying.
movement of labor as well. There could be that supply chain could also potentially be transitioned and transformed. The CHIPS Act, which the US passed, was all about bringing semiconductors back to the US. Not that there's not going to be reliance and partnership on the very significant investments in semiconductors in Taiwan and in South Korea, but the recognition that for resilience, you need to have capacity internally within the country. So I think that recalibration is happening. So if you think of the forces at work, some of these are post-COVID. I think some of these are societal norm resetting. Some of these are technology driven because of technology and its capabilities. The other is this recognition that you need to be more resilient to disruption. And resiliency to disruption has led perhaps to a pullback, if you will, from being entirely globalized, where you manufacture or source work from where economically it's optimal, because that objective function only took costs into account. It didn't take resiliency into account. It didn't take geopolitical aspects into account. So all of those entered into the objective function in a more direct way post-COVID.
Oh my God, I love this. I love this thought. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay. Instead of optimizing only for cost, you're now optimizing for resilience, self-dependence, etc. Okay, wow. Okay, that's a fabulous thought. let's see how this thought pans out. I'm very curious to see, because I mean, it's sort of the antithesis of where the world was going, right? Pre-COVID, the world was going towards more and more globalization. All of us read about the merits of globalization. Everything was about, you source where things are cheaper. If we see a reverse movement, then it's going to surely change the world order, so to speak.
So
Okay, thank
Vibha, the onset of this actually began even pre-COVID, in my view. The Trump administration in the US, and I think there was some of this began pre-COVID,
you.
because the view was that this was globalization in its pure form, perhaps did not take sufficient account of these dependencies, these risks that, and they came to the fore. There was a spotlight on those problems during COVID. It wasn't like before COVID, people didn't recognize that that risk existed. But when a crisis happens, you face it. Now it's explicit. Now policymakers and business leaders are responding to it.
Sure. Okay. Great. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. That's very unique perspective. Since you talked about technology and you touched upon AI, I have been speaking to many experts in the AI space. I've spoken to the head of AI at Uber in California. Of course, when I speak to somebody who works directly in the domain, there's a lot of optimism, right? Because day in and day out, they're seeing the merits of AI.
Mhm.
From your vantage point, where do you see AI as revolutionary technology in the next 5 or 7 years? And is AI the technology, or do you see something else brewing as people are sort of drinking the Kool-Aid on AI? Is there something else that's going on in the tech space that we need to look out for?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that AI has been around for a while.
Hmm.
Okay, so we talk to our phones, we talk to Siri,
Sure.
we
Google
get
Maps.
recommendations from Netflix, we do Google Maps. It's been part and parcel of our lives well before Chat GPT. So that's important to keep in mind. I think, though, we've gone through some AI winters. My PhD thesis in 30 plus years ago was on expert systems, and then they went bust because they didn't scale. They were too brittle. And then you have the emergence of neural networks as a technology, and that has grown to the point now where the so-called transformer networks has resulted in one key difference. In the past, there's a concept of building what are called narrow AIs. That is, for specific applications, you would build an AI. So I would build an AI for healthcare decision support. I'd build an AI for, like in Google Maps. I would build an AI for doing language translation, so on and so forth. What this new foundation model approach has brought to the fore is this idea of what's called a broad AI. I train a model with no specific downstream application in mind. I incur a high fixed cost.
Mhm.
I train it on a vast amount of data, but with very low marginal cost, I can actually create fine-tuned applications
For different
um,
use.
that for different application domains. Now, the cost structure is very different than with narrow AIs, where I would incur this cost every time I needed to stand up a narrow AI. Now, admittedly, it was not as expensive as the initial fixed cost of creating this foundation model, but the Googles and the Open AIs and the Anthropics of the world, and that's actually one of the problems in my view. Now, from a US standpoint, they're all US firms, but nevertheless, it's an oligopoly. I mean, there's only like 4 or 5 firms that have the resources, the capacity to have built these models. Now, Meta has made its a model in part open source, and there's Mistral from France, which is also open source. But I think the basic idea is that these models are incurring that huge fixed cost to create a broad AI,
Mhm.
and then they're going to be fine-tuned for a particular application with relatively low cost. And what's been remarkable, I guess, for people in the know, it's not been remarkable, but nevertheless, even for people who are like us who are working in the field, some of the capabilities being demonstrated by these models is it's we are still trying to understand why is it able to do what it's able to do, that kind of thing. So I think one change, so it's not that AI is new, but there has been this change in the capability of the AI, but also this narrow AI to broad AI, this idea of foundation models. So I think that's an important shift. The other, I think, has to do with the fact that the AI now is capable of dealing with multimodal inputs. So it's not just numbers, it's text, it's audio, it's images, it's video. So you all are very familiar with, I'm sure, poems being written and articles being written, etc. But I think where the real interesting stuff is going to happen is if, I mean, I don't know what the equivalent of IKEA in Mumbai is. Maybe there's IKEA in Mumbai.
Like, yeah.
But so I think there is, if you go get a chair or something that you're going to have to put together, you could, if you see the Gemini video, this is the foundation model from Google. You could imagine when Gemini Ultra is released soon, that it could actually critique your, it could say, Vibha, you've put the wrong piece in, this often happens, when you're assembling these things, when you buy them online and have to assemble it. So in other words, it's not going to be purely digital. The AI is going to be able to do things or advise you about what's going on in the physical world. So it's not just about writing a better poem or writing a better piece of software, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to also deal with this digital to physical. And I think so from that standpoint, that's the optimism part, which is, there's lots of opportunity. Now, does it come with issues? Yes, because I think there are risks associated with how reliable the AI is, because fundamentally it's a statistical approach. That's why you hear about hallucinations, you hear about errors that the AI commits. So how reliable does the AI have to be? Well, it's going to be very use case dependent. I mean, what you need for healthcare is going to be very different than what you need for movie recommendations or for shopping, because the consequentiality of the application is very different, right? So I think this issue of knowing how to think about responsible deployment of AI is going to be quite critical in terms of deciding which use cases, which sectors are going to be early adopters. If you look at where you're seeing early adoption of this technology, it's in effectively non-consequential, unregulated, where there is data type of application, like customer service, shopping recommendations. If I make a mistake, it's not as big a deal as if I gave you a wrong diagnosis, right? So I think we are very much in this phase of trying to understand this fit between the technology and its current state of capability, and what applications or use cases or business processes are best a good fit. And when we work with firms, I think this is what I hear from CEOs, where I think they're asking three questions. I think they're asking, what is the opportunity with regard to AI? Is it ready for prime time, if you will? And for what applications within my organization could it be used? Is it to be used as a cost savings, or is it really to create new revenue? I mean, that kind of question that is being asked. And I think to a large extent, if you look at the deployments, the early deployments are in things like customer service. It's going to be interesting in terms of how it's being used in software engineering. So there, it's a very different type of application than customer service, but one where you have, like the Copilot that Microsoft has out there, the GitHub Copilot, that allows for programmers to be more productive. The interesting issues there are, if I can make my lower skill programmers be more productive, but yet not get everybody to be caught in groupthink by virtue of using the same foundation model, how do I balance productivity growth on the one hand and on the other creativity? Because you don't want everybody singing off the same sheet by virtue of using the same AI type of model. I think these are all questions that CEOs are trying to calibrate on the opportunity. And in the risks and responsibility part, I think it depends
I
on
want to touch a
which.
little bit upon what, on the application and implementation side. I actually attended one of Google's releases on Gemini. And as a layperson, I said, let me just go on to this webinar. They had this free webinar. And since I'm researching the book, and after 5 minutes, I couldn't follow anything they were saying because they talked about the stack and how you could take stuff from the stack. And then I realized that this is for hardcore developers. So I'm just wondering, as a, a decently well-educated person, I was completely lost. So, is this application and implementation of AI across? If they're trying to make, because some of the people you talk to, they say, "Hey, AI is going to be everything, everywhere, every day." This is like the slogan I'm hearing from the believers. But I'm sitting here thinking, but like, I don't know how to implement it in my business. I tried to read this thing, I couldn't figure it out. So, is this going to develop into sort of like a SaaS product where they will take this AI technology and say, here's AI for education, here's AI module for health tech? How is this going to become as widespread as they're talking about? I'm not understanding how it's going to reach the grassroots.
Yeah, great question. By the way, we have a Sloan Management Review article coming out shortly. But I think the when I mentioned Copilot, that is an example of if you were running a business where you had engineers developing software within your business, this is a way in which you could get them to be more productive because the AI would recommend snippets of code that they could use, thereby making them more productive.
Sure.
AI is now being integrated into Microsoft Office,
Hmm.
into Google Docs, into Google Slides. So if you were running a small foundation, small business, you could imagine you don't need to know anything about the AI. It's going to be delivered to you, like you said, via a SaaS product that
Okay.
you're using anyway. So
Hmm.
when you're filing taxes, like TurboTax will have AI in it. It already does, but it'll have more AI in it. So I could imagine if you're using Salesforce, Salesforce will have AI in it.
Hmm.
So I think most people will interact with the AI by virtue of it being blended into what it
Embedded
is that
into.
they're
Okay.
doing,
Okay.
embedded, and it's going to just allow them to be more productive and be more efficient. But there are some strategic issues of the sort that I was just getting to, which had to do with this productivity enhancement on the one hand, and how do we ensure that creativity doesn't get lost in this process? If everybody's using the same AI, how do we ensure that balance is struck?
Hmm.
The I don't know if I answered your question on that
Yes.
on this issue. The other question that CEOs are concerned with, these are largely large firms. I'm talking about Fortune 100, Fortune 500 type firms, is that they're thinking about risks and responsibilities, not just on themselves in terms of how do I deploy this responsibly, um, where I understand, let's say I was using this for hiring, and um, the AI recommends somebody to interview, and that person is not a good candidate to interview, then that's just an additional cost on the firm.
Yeah.
But if it excludes somebody from an interview that should have been interviewed, that's a cost to the individual and to society.
Mhm.
And if that type of error, what we call a type 2 error, which I'm sure you remember from your CMU days, um, is systemic, meaning I apply to Microsoft and I get denied. I apply to Google, I get denied. And not because of the denial is because of some systemic error in the AI. So that's an example of how we need to do a lot of due diligence before deployment of the AI to ensure that these kinds of errors don't exist, because the costs are borne by individuals and by society. And so I think if you ask the question about responsible use, that comes up often. Hiring is an example, but these are what are called high risk applications in the EU AI Act.
The
So I
risk.
think
So,
depending on which markets you're in,
sure.
the CEOs are thinking about compliance, and it's still very much an unsettled space in terms of EU is very different. India is not really regulating it. US has got an executive order. So very different policy landscape.
Okay, so since you touched upon the policy, right? When I couple of my interviews, I asked people like, what is the dark side of AI? And I had someone from a life sciences in the US, in fact, and she talked about how with gene editing, you're able to now potentially produce a child. And she said the technology exists for this. You can produce a child and say, look, give this child like make him like 10 feet tall, give him a broad shoulder, chest, whatever. You basically can create a new army or like just a new human race in that sense. I spoke to somebody, who talked about terrorism, and they said, if you have suddenly bots attacking your borders, today you can identify the enemy, right? You can say this is how he looked, this is the physical features. If suddenly you have drones coming in and you can't identify, like very, very obvious and very realistic threats of to humanity. Do you see this as the dark side, or do you think this is exaggerated and this is not
No,
really?
I think there are near-term risks. I mean, there are the people who have concerns about what are called existential risks to humanity. And then there are more near-term risks. The bias example I gave you from hiring is an example of a near-term kind of risk. But you could imagine, things that are very consequential, with elections coming, I know in India, but also in the US, I think 2 billion people go to the polls in 2024. It's a huge number. Um, I think the big concern is that generative AI is going to really create a lot of misinformation and disinformation and that's why the question of ensuring we know what the provenance is of content that's on digital media. Do we know if this was AI generated or was this human generated?
Mm.
Is this a video that, we've had a video that shows President Biden falling down, but that was a made up video, for instance. So I think the issues of deep fakes, as they're called, I think that's going to be, so I think if you don't have a shared set of facts or truth, it creates a fundamental threat to democracy. So I think that is a concern with AI allowing for content to be created in ways that are personalized to you, that previously could have been done, but the cost structure has changed tremendously. So the cost of being able to personalize content to you in ways that can manipulate you um, has declined considerably. And that you could argue that that's on the one hand could be used for by marketing and sales, but on the other hand, that the dark side in some senses that it could be used in electioneering in ways that are harmful to
Okay.
democracy,
Wow.
right?
Interesting. Okay. So since you touched upon, and like we can use this as a segue from technology into policy making. You touched upon this, right? Like most of the technology is now owned by three or four firms, making into some sort of oligopoly. Do you see this changing over time? Do you see the power centers changing? Do you see governments coming in and saying, doing a swoop down and saying, which we had with the Microsoft antitrust thing many years ago? Do you think governments are going to come in and say that now, this technology and the data you have on hand is just, it's too precious and you got to share it with the government or share it equally amongst each other? Like, how do you see this whole power struggle panning out?
So again, really interesting question. I think the big wild card is how open source is playing out. So the argument could be made that the new open source models from Meta and from Mistral, which is from France, and then Falcon is from the UAE, arguably are uh, creating models that are very competitive. Now, are they as good as Gemini or GPT-4? No, but they're very competitive. But I think there are two sorts of issues here. I think one, has to do with there's this huge fixed cost, both in terms of compute and in terms of data, that are required to create these models. Very few firms have the capacity to, in fact, very few governments even have the resources that these firms have to create these models. Now, it might be a national priority or a policy of some countries to say they should develop their own foundation models. as a means of national security, for instance, not to be just dependent on. It's a version of the supply chain problem, if you want to think of it that way. Because I think the vast majority of organizations are going to be deployers. They're not going to be developers.
Oh,
So
exactly.
there are the OpenAIs, the Googles, Microsoft, etc. They're the developers, and then a bunch of downstream firms are going to
Deploy that.
license. Yeah, they're going to take the technology and then deploy it,
Yeah.
and it could. So an example that I can think of is where you have OpenAI, GPT-4, SAP then creates a hiring application using GPT plus SAP, and then sells it to, let's say, Mumbai city, that then uses it for recruiting purposes.
Yeah.
And here you have a value chain or a chain that's been created, but with very different jurisdictions. OpenAI is in the US, you have SAP maybe in Germany, you have deployment in India. So I think there are a bunch of policy questions that are now coming up as to what are the obligations, what is the liability, what if something goes wrong in Mumbai, and Mumbai has to explain why a hiring decision was not made correctly. Somebody files a lawsuit, let's say. Then how are these models going to be? What's the explanation for why Vibha's application was denied, for instance? What is the obligation on SAP? What's the obligation on OpenAI? I think there are these kinds of issues. I think that's a big question in this chain of obligation and liability going both ways.
Mhm.
And I think the other is, and you've seen this with the New York Times lawsuit with OpenAI, this has to do with copyright, IP kinds of. Do you and I own, um, have ownership over how we speak, how we walk, how we talk? Right now, the law doesn't actually protect that. Now, if I have enough images of myself or you, or your writing, I could create content that sounds like you, that looks like you. So I think this is going to be a big question. And this is, the Screen Actors Guild strike
Mm.
in Hollywood had to do with actors being concerned about what happens to their images, what happens to their you know, do I own what ownership do I have of my own self, right? I think these are all fundamentally new questions that are coming up.
Okay. And since these questions are coming up, how is policy making and how is law keeping up with this? Are you seeing anything coming up? Are you seeing any sort of announcements coming up? What's the current chitter chatter in terms of policy
Well, I
making?
mean, I think with regard, there are some things that are purely open questions. Right now, I think the lawsuit from New York Times against OpenAI, and there are other such lawsuits against Stable Diffusion, etc. I think those are going to be resolved, and as they resolve, we'll learn at least how the US is thinking about it. I'm sure India will think about this, and so will Europe. Where you see the first sets of policy making being done as in law versus executive order. As you know, an executive order, tomorrow, if some other administration is in power, they may negate an executive order. It doesn't have the force of law. But President Biden did sign a very comprehensive executive order. The EU AI Act that was passed just recently, I think that brings some clarity towards how EU is thinking about regulating AI.
Mhm.
Um, but they're not addressing the IP and copyright issues. Those are still open. I think they are laying out what should be the obligations and considerations for which types of applications are considered high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And for each of those risk categories, what kind of due diligence would have to be done before they can actually be deployed, and which applications are forbidden. So, for instance, facial recognition and ability to identify using biometrics is forbidden other than for national security or for law
Oh, wow.
enforcement, for
Okay.
instance.
Mm.
So I think um, the EU has laid this out. Now, I think the US executive order follows a risk tiered approach, not unlike what the Europeans have done. The Chinese have had a very different approach. In September of last year, they signed a policy, a law about generative AI, where they had again, societal values are reflected in this, which is you have to register and get a license from the government even to operate an open source model in China. Now, that's a very different model than what obtains in India or in the US. So they have a very tightly controlled and monitored AI ecosystem. So, in other words, if somebody creates a deep fake of you, they can only do that legally if you've given them permission to give a deep fake, and that has to be documented. So the creator, his or her identity is known because everybody has the equivalent of an ID card. The tools that they've used each have been licensed and registered with the government. So they have complete visibility of the chain that
Okay.
led to, and this is something that perhaps can only
Happen.
probably be implemented. Yeah.
But now, this is very interesting. You're saying each sort of geography is coming up with its own laws and regulations, but it just explained to me the whole supply chain where something's developed in the US, it's gone through Europe, through SAP, and now coming through India. So you have this globalization effect, but you have independent governing countries developing their own laws. Now, how do you see this panning out in the future? Because if each country is going to come up with their own independent laws, but they're still interdependent, then it's going to create some sort of mayhem. But is that what you're seeing in the future, or do you see some sort of global?
No, I think there will be harmonization to ensure. So today, for instance, SAP, which is a European firm, sells in India, and they have to conform to Indian rules. So with AI, if decision making is involved and the decision making is viewed to be consequential, and something goes wrong, and if this is a deployment in Europe, they're going to have to meet some a due diligence. They have to demonstrate that they've actually done this kind of testing, maybe third-party firm like a PwC or a Deloitte claim, just like you have auditing of financial statements
Yeah.
against GAAP principles. I think there's a version of that is expected for high-risk applications in the EU, right? Now, I don't know what India is going to require for these kinds of high-risk applications. The US will have some version of what I just laid out. So depending on the jurisdiction, and I think what firms that are global are likely going to have to, if a firm like SAP says, you know what, we conform to what Europe requires, that's above what everybody else requires, then we're good. So we could then do business in multiple domains. So I think you're going to see harmonization. But I think you're raising an interesting point because a vast number of countries, now India arguably has the capacity to be both a developer and a deployer country,
Sure.
because and Bhashini, which is a very interesting initiative by the Indian government to have, because we have so many languages in India. Um, for instance, going natural language translation across Indian languages, because I think one of the reasons why you want capability like this is that sometimes global efforts or efforts located in North America or Europe might not pay attention to lower resource languages, lower resource requirements in countries, for instance, like in India. But I think the vast number of countries are going to be purely deployer countries. So I think there is a sense that they have as to, it's almost like a market power kind of question, right? So if I was an open AI and I was deploying in a small country and there were vulnerabilities found in the deployment, what's the obligation on OpenAI to fix that vulnerability within a service level, a period of time that is reasonable? I think it's not just high level policy, but operationalizing the policy to a point where there would be obligations and commitments and liability. I think those have to be worked out.
They have to be worked on. Okay, great. Okay, let's shift to the last sort of section of the pillars that I wanted to touch upon. Of course, education in your capacity as dean. and obviously Dean of Carnegie Mellon, which so many years ago when I was a student, I think was such a futuristic campus even back then. What are we doing in terms of curriculum? What changes have you seen? What are we doing on campus to equip students to be future ready?
So I think, first and foremost, I think what you mentioned at the outset as what CMU has taught you to be really good at is to be a really good critical thinker, a good systems thinker, be able to be a good problem solver. And I think those skills are going to stand the test of time. So when you're facing a new problem, how do you identify what the problem is, what the root problem is? How do you scope the boundary of the problem, identify who the stakeholders are, who would care if this problem was solved? All of those kinds of questions that are not technology questions. Those are fundamental questions about how to take on any problem and address it, right? So that's core. Now, second to that is, depending on what it is you're studying, we want you to be really equipped as somebody who can always learn new things, learning to learn. So you have to be a good critical and systems thinker. You have to be able to learn new things. And I'm sure in the years since you've graduated, you've learned lots of new things. Um, and and I think if the curriculum exposes you and stresses you in ways that you're required to learn new things, and you imbibe and develop an approach that works for you to learn new things, I think that's the second most important thing. And the third, I think, is learning how to value and connect with people, human relationships, because they matter, and being a good communicator, being able to articulate ideas clearly. So all three of these pillars that I've outlined have nothing to do with technology.
Sure.
Systems thinking, learning to learn, but they're all about functioning well in a world where change is rapid and change is constant. So at CMU, certainly how we deliver education is being, we're thinking hard about, hey, how do you get people to think about using generative AI? So there is the aspect of how should AI be integrated into the delivery of, let's say you're teaching history, not technology, but teaching history or teaching English. What role does a generative AI have to play? How can you get students perhaps to um, write early drafts and get critiques from ChatGPT so that they learn that entire process versus just the lazy process of just getting whatever it produces and turning that in. So I think there's a whole question of how do you adapt teaching and education to a world where you have new technology capability. We have done this before, we'll do it again. And then there is the other aspect of how do you equip people to go out and be really useful contributors to a world where technology is changing the nature of, so how do you generate value from the technology? How do you deploy it responsibly, be it in business, be it in societal sectors, be it in the not-for-profit sector, or if you want to be a technology innovator. We have such an amazing School of Arts and College of Fine Arts, as you know. So how does the creative set of activities, like from music to drama to painting, how does art and music and drama, how do they change in a world where you have AI? I mean, these are all fascinating questions. I
Are
think
they
we
are
are.
they doing that now? Because when we were on campus, the drama school and the musicians, as fabulous as they were quite siloed, and their curriculum didn't require them to take courses in programming, like the other schools. Like as a business major, I had to do a lot of courses, but the arts were treated as quite distinct. But what you're raising now is what we're hearing a lot of, right? Like it's sort of thing like everyone needs to know a little bit of everything in addition to what you is your core area. And
Right, but you don't have to be a programmer, Vibha. So in other words, I don't think, if anything, I think what's going to happen is natural language is going to become the lingua franca for engaging and interacting with systems. So if you look at, say, ChatGPT, and you give it a prompt in English, it can maybe create a program that then can be executed to return a result to you. So if you remember, the big challenge was you might have had a tremendous set of creative ideas, but the friction was being able to translate that into something that the computer could
Sure.
actually
Absolutely. Yeah.
you that is shrinking tremendously because of this advent of generative AI. So I think the capacity to, if you've seen the demos, I draw a website
Yeah.
and it generates a website for me.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, then I don't need the programmer as the go-between. I
Mhm.
can interact directly with the AI using a modality that I'm comfortable. I think that's where we're headed.
And are you seeing
But
that happening in terms of curriculum? Are you seeing at the
I think we are early in our journey.
okay.
I think in different parts of campus at Heinz, for instance, where we've it's a very strong data analytics program, both in the information systems as well as in the public policy areas. It's been a natural evolution to include AI, both for policy making. So it's AI for policy making as also policy for AI. So think of it as going both ways. So you could, and similarly with regard to how to manage AI systems, how are they different from traditional digital information technologies? I think so. There's all of that going on at Heinz because that's who we are. But if
So
you were
what
the
about
School of
the
Fine
ethics side
Arts,
of it? So the ethics side of it, which originally might come under the liberal arts, is that being now implemented in the sciences and the science departments?
well, I mean, great question. So the whole idea of responsible AI is that you want to draw strongly on ethics.
Correct.
In the Block Center for Technology and Society, which I established in 2019 at CMU, is a university-wide effort and draws strongly on the ethics strengths that we have both in philosophy, which is in the humanities and social sciences school, but also from the public policy school, the business school. Tepper has people who work in business ethics. So I think this ability to then think about what does it mean to use AI ethically. You brought up the role in the context of the sciences. The big concern there has been from a potential malicious use has been, will somebody use the AI to come up with a protein or a genome that is like the next COVID?
Yeah.
That could be the next bio terror type. So I think it's those kinds of, and though that's, so when people, you mentioned earlier, existential risks, people are concerned. I think the concern is, could the AI then be used to develop, uh, you know, uh, be they bioweapons or other such,
Sure.
by actors with very different, smaller cost structure. All of that is great for efficiency and productivity in the world, but it could also be used by malcontents and malicious folks to create things that can really hurt humanity.
So you are saying that there is a movement, a more interdisciplinary movement, and do you see that as necessary for being ready for being future ready? There is this
I
part of
think without a doubt. So
that.
I think I think the idea of a T-shaped individual has always been, you need to know some area well, but you need to have the part of the T, the top part of the T, were the three things that I mentioned, which is critical thinking, learning to learn, and being able to uh, have good relationships with people, be able to lead across differences, work with people with very different backgrounds and lived experiences, be a good communicator. Those are the general
Mhm.
sort of, and then you could be a great history,
Any
major.
one domain, you're saying? Any one
Yeah,
domain?
but the interdisciplinarity comes from the first part, because for you to be a good critical or systems thinker or learning to learn, you're going to have to be exposed to multiple disciplines. And AI, for instance, the way we see it at CMU is it is a multidisciplinary enterprise.
Mm. If you had to go back to IIT Chennai and
IIT
reconsider
Madras, it's still IIT Madras.
IIT Madras, let's call it IIT Madras. If you had to go back today and pick a
Yeah.
major, what would it be? Considering you know all these things now and you know what's coming, kind of, what do you think you'd build your T horizontal vertical in?
So actually, as it turned out, I was a mechie. I was a mechanical engineer. and then studied operations research and computing, and then did information systems and operations research for my PhD. Um, and I think I don't know whether the major made as much of a difference to me as what IIT gave me, I think, was confidence that I could compete in a very competitive pool of and hang out with people who were very smart, far smarter than myself. And second, I think it was this idea of curiosity, learning to learn. I think those things were taught very early at IIT, in whether it was intentional or not. I think those things were imbibed early. Now, um, would I be somebody who would study my if I were to think of my son and my daughter? um, I have two kids. My wife and I have two kids, and one of them is somebody who studied computer science and statistics. There's a major at CMU called StatML, Statistics and Machine Learning, which is across statistics and computer science. And my daughter studied economics, and she read English at Oxford. Um, and Divya, my daughter, she's a VP of product marketing at a big tech company. And my son Deepak is a senior software. He's the younger one. He's a senior software engineer at a large tech company. Now, I could imagine that each one of them could have gone very different ways, but I hope that they got the core foundational elements that I mentioned to you. So I don't know where I would say, you know what, I should have studied something else. We didn't have computer science, by the way. We got computer science halfway through my journey at IIT Madras, when computer science was introduced as an undergraduate. I'm
Like,
that old.
so like just keeping your eyes on the future, right? We get asked this all the time, and I have parents ask me all the time, like, what should my child study? My child is extremely bright, can get into anything. How must one pick their T horizontal or T vertical? How do you decide on your
What they're excited about.
what you're
What
excited?
they're excited about. Yeah, totally. I mean, my daughter was excited about English and behavioral decision making, and she went and studied English at Oxford and economics at CMU. And I think it's about what you're excited about. Now, did she go out and become an economist and work in economics? Perhaps not, because she's in a tech company. But she claims that in her role as a VP of product marketing, that this combo of English and economics actually helps her a great deal. So I think it's not about how do I pick and what's the optimal choice given what the future holds. I don't think I would go that way.
Okay, and I'll close with the last question. There's so much chatter. As I told you, I talked to the AI experts, and there's a lot of man versus machine used to be sort of the jingoism earlier, but now it's man with machine, right? How much of man with machine are you seeing genuinely pan out in the real world? How much of like co-botting are we going to do, and how much of machines going to take over our lives and our classrooms, more importantly? Do you really seeing robots taking over classrooms, physical classrooms? Do you really see robots buzzing around our homes, or do you think this idea is very far-fetched?
I think the idea of people augmenting their work with AI, and it might not, I mean, I don't know, when we say augmenting work with AI, it's almost like there's a cobot standing next to me. No, I think it's like, take Zoom right now, right? If you wave your hand or if you do this, you have the AI now in an AI enabled version of Zoom, which actually reads your features and gives you a thumbs up. It adds, in other words, you're going to see integration of AI into so many things that you do that it's like when Excel came about, and then Excel had all these additional add-ons, features that allowed you to do stuff. To my to my mind, I think that's the metaphor, that you are going to be using a whole bunch of tools that are going to have AI integrated. Now, the vast majority of us are going to have that kind of experience. To give you an example with education, there's actually a research project that a couple of colleagues of mine are doing, which is in working with middle schools in Pittsburgh. kids who are who struggle in algebra, um, if you gave them individual attention, like one teacher to each student, you could reduce the gap between the high performer and the student at the bottom of the distribution, which can be as much as 2 standard deviations. Um, but it's not scalable. You can't give every student a teacher. So there is an AI called a cognitive tutor that allows for one teacher to work with 10 students. So in other words, it changes the scale ratio, but it yields the same result as if that individual is working with a student. Now, that's a great example of AI as a force multiplier or as an enabler that allows for this reduction in learning performance by virtue of the fact that you have an AI complementing the human teacher, who, by the way, may perform additional roles beyond just learning, right? If you are my teacher, I may look up to you as a role model, as somebody I aspire to be like Vibha, for instance, um, in addition to you teaching me math or whatever.
Oh, of course.
So the AI can help with the latter, but not the former. You
Oh,
still need the human role model, aspirational aspects, while enabling you, the teacher, to be more effective in the classroom. So I
mhm.
see that as the metaphor for the most part. Now, will there be some jobs that are entirely automated? Yes, there will be. I mean, so for instance, if you look at automated teller machines way back when, and banking debits and credits, do we still have bank tellers? Yes, we do. Do they do exactly the same work that old bank tellers did? No, they don't. They do a very different set of things. So I think there are certain jobs are going to be totally automated because the technology is going to be able to perform every task of that particular occupation and do it well enough that you don't need a human. But I think for the vast majority, it's some of those tasks that are going to be done by the AI, the other by the human, and you're going to see this combination of human plus the AI.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. But it looks like AI is here to stay and hopefully augment our lives for the better and not for the worse. This has been an amazing conversation. It's flashback 20 years to me sitting in Carnegie Mellon. I feel like I have to come back to campus now and
Oh,
listen
you
and
should. Please do.
because this was just fabulous. My mind is buzzing. It's late at night here in India, but I'm as I'm wide awake and wired thanks to you and amazing insights. Going to add a lot of value to the conversation and to the narrative. Thank you so much for doing this. I will be in touch and truly appreciate this. Much
Thank you.
appreciate
Have a good evening. Bye bye.
it.